The morning silence of Redwood Falls was shattered by a single word that would unravel 3 years of lies, expose a killer who walked among them as a friend, and prove that sometimes the voiceless carry the most dangerous truths of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and desperation through the streets of Redwood Falls as Sheriff Jake Morrison adjusted his badge and stepped into the crowded town square. The courthouse steps had been transformed into an impromptu auction block, where human misery was about to be converted into cold, hard currency. Jake had seen enough of these debt auctions to know they were legal vultures feeding on tragedy, but today felt different. Today, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. His weathered hands, scarred from years of breaking up saloon fights and tracking down outlaws, rested uneasily on his gun belt as he surveyed the gathering crowd. At 34, Jake Morrison had the kind of face that inspired both trust and fear in equal measure. Deep green eyes that missed nothing, a strong jaw marked by a thin scar from a knife fight 2 winters back, and the quiet confidence of a man who'd learned to read trouble before it announced itself. He'd been sheriff of Redwood Falls for 5 years, ever since the previous lawman had been found face down in Willow Creek with a bullet in his back. The crowd was typical for these grim proceedings: opportunistic farmers looking for cheap labor, wealthy merchants seeking household help, and the occasional predator hunting for something darker. Jake's stomach turned as he recognized several faces that had no business being at a legitimate auction. Men like Silas Crawford, who owned the territory's largest brothel, and gentleman Pete Hawkins, whose plantation-style estate was rumored to be worked by people who'd entered freely but never seemed to leave. Auctioneer Edmund Briggs climbed the courthouse steps with his leather-bound ledger, his voice already warming up for the day's proceedings. Briggs was a thin, nervous man with thinning hair and the kind of mustache that tried too hard to make him look important. He'd been conducting these auctions for nearly a decade, and Jake had always suspected the man enjoyed his work a little. Too much. "Gentlemen, ladies, welcome to this morning's debt settlement auction," Briggs called out, his voice carrying across the square with practiced authority. "As always, all sales are final, payments in cash only, and contracts are binding. For the full term specified." Jake positioned himself where he could see the entire crowd while keeping an eye on the courthouse doors. Something had been nagging at him all morning, a persistent itch between his shoulder blades that usually meant trouble was brewing. 3 years of being sheriff had taught him to trust those instincts, even when he couldn't explain them. But first few lots were predictable: a middle-aged man whose farm had failed, an elderly woman whose late husband's gambling debts had consumed her savings, a young couple whose mercantile business had been crushed by the arrival of the railroad. Each story was a small tragedy, lives upended by circumstances beyond their control, but these were the routine casualties of frontier economics. Then Briggs cleared his throat and consulted his ledger with what looked like distaste. "Next item, ladies and gentlemen, lot number 7, Miss Rebecca Hayes, age approximately 18. Circumstances are unusual." Jake felt his attention sharpen. In his experience, unusual circumstances at debt auctions usually meant someone was about to get hurt. "Miss Hayes is unable to speak," Briggs continued, his voice taking on the clinical tone he used when describing damaged goods. "She was found wandering the territory road 6 months ago, apparently the sole survivor of a wagon train attack. No family has been located, no debts of her own, but she's been a ward of the county since her discovery. The territorial authority has determined that she should be placed in productive employment to offset the costs of her care." A murmur ran through the crowd, part curiosity and part calculation. A mute girl with no family and no past was either worthless or extremely valuable, depending on what a man intended to do with her. She emerged from the courthouse flanked by 2 county deputies, and Jake felt something cold settle in his chest. Rebecca Hayes was small, maybe 5 feet and a few inches, with auburn hair that caught the morning light and skin pale enough to suggest she'd spent the last 6 months indoors. She wore a simple grey dress that had seen better days and boots that were too large for her feet, but it was her eyes that stopped Jake cold. Large, expressive brown eyes that held intelligence, pain, and something else he couldn't quite identify. Fear, certainly, but underneath it was a hardness that spoke of someone who'd seen things no 18-year-old should witness. She moved with the careful grace of someone who'd learned to be invisible, her gaze sweeping the crowd with the wariness of prey animals surrounded by predators. When her eyes met Jake's across the square, he saw recognition flicker there, though he was certain they'd never met. "The girl can hear perfectly well," Briggs was explaining to the crowd. "She follows instructions, can perform domestic duties, and according to the doctor who examined her, there's no physical reason for her inability to speak. Trauma-related, most likely. Terms of 5 years of indenture service, or until such. Time as family is located to claim responsibility." Jake found himself studying the girl more carefully. There was something familiar about her features, something that tugged at his memory like a half-remembered dream. The shape of her face, the way she held her shoulders, even the defiant tilt of her chin, reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. "Let's start the bidding at $20, Briggs called out. "Come now, gentlemen, she's young and healthy, perfect for household work or—" He let the sentence hang, his meaning clear to everyone present. Silence stretched across the square, like a taut rope. $20 was good money, but a mute girl was an unknown quantity. She couldn't answer questions, couldn't report abuse, couldn't even scream for help if things went wrong. For decent men, that made her too vulnerable to consider. For indecent men, it made her irresistible. $15, came a voice from the back of the crowd. Jake turned to see Silas Crawford pushing forward, his bulk straining against a coat that had seen too many meals and not enough exercise. Crawford's face was flushed with excitement and something darker that made Jake's hand drift toward his gun. $15 for the girl, Briggs acknowledged. "Do I hear 20? 25, called out another voice. This one belonged to Morris Ketchum, a rancher from the Eastern Valley who'd buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. Ketchum was a tall, lean man with dead eyes and hands that were always too clean for someone who claimed to work cattle. The bidding was picking. Up now, voices calling out numbers while Rebecca Hayes stood motionless in the center of it all. Jake watched her face, seeing the careful mask she wore to hide her emotions. But her hands told a different story. They were clenched into fists at her. Sides, and he could see them trembling slightly. $30, Crawford shouted, his voice thick with anticipation. "And I'll take her today, right now." Something in the man's tone made Jake's blood run cold. He'd dealt with Crawford before, had pulled beaten girls from his establishment, had buried others who hadn't been strong enough to survive whatever went on behind those locked doors. The thought of this mute girl ending up there made his stomach turn, but it was more than professional duty that stirred something protective in Jake's chest. There was something about Rebecca Hayes that called to him, some connection he couldn't explain. Maybe it was the way she held herself with quiet dignity despite her circumstances. Maybe it was the intelligence he saw in her eyes, trapped behind walls of silence and trauma, or maybe it was something else entirely, some instinct that told him this girl held secrets that could change everything. $40, Ketchum counted, his cold eyes fixed on Rebecca with the intensity of a snake watching a mouse. Jake had seen enough. He'd spent 5 years watching predators circle the vulnerable, had buried too many victims of men who saw human beings as property to be used and discarded. "Not today, not this girl. $100, Jake called out, his voice cutting through the crowd chatter like a blade. The square went silent. $100 was a fortune, more money than most people in Redwood Falls saw in 6 months. For an indenture contract, it was unprecedented. Briggs blinked rapidly, clearly struggling to process the bid. "Did you say $100, Sheriff Morrison?" $100, Jake confirmed, stepping forward so the entire crowd could see him. "Cash money, paid in full." Crawford spun around, his face purple with rage. "You can't be serious, Morrison. What does a sheriff want with a mute girl?" Jake met his gaze steadily, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept Redwood Falls peaceful for 5 years. "That's my business, Crawford. You got a problem with legal bidding?" The threat was clear enough. Crawford was many things, but he wasn't stupid enough to challenge the sheriff in front of half the town. He stepped back, his hands clenched into fists, but he held his tongue. 110, Ketchum called out desperately. 200, Jake replied without hesitation. Now the crowd was stirring uneasily. This wasn't how debt auctions were supposed to go. They were supposed to be quick, efficient affairs where desperate people went to the lowest bidder. Sheriff Morrison was turning it into something else entirely. Rebecca Hayes was staring at him now, those brown eyes trying to read his intentions. Jake could see the questions there, the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust anyone's motives. She'd probably never encountered a man who bid on her to protect rather than possess. Briggs was sweating now, clearly out of his depth. "Going, Hunters," he called uncertainly. 250, Crawford snarled, but his voice lacked conviction. Even he wasn't foolish enough to get into a bidding war with the sheriff when there were other, quieter ways to get what he wanted. $500, Jake said quietly. The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. $500 was serious money, enough to buy a ranch or start a business. The kind of money that transformed lives and changed destinies. Briggs' mouth fell open. Even Crawford stepped back, recognizing that he was outmatched. $500 said that Sheriff Morrison wanted this girl more than anyone else was willing to pay, and it raised uncomfortable questions about his motives. But Jake wasn't thinking about appearances or questions. He was thinking about the intelligence he saw in Rebecca Hayes' eyes, the strength it must have taken to survive whatever had left her voiceless and alone. He was thinking about his brother Daniel, who'd been found murdered 3 years ago with no leads and no justice. Most of all, he was thinking about the strange certainty that had settled in his chest the moment he'd seen her. The feeling that Rebecca Hayes was connected to his past in ways he didn't yet understand. "Going once," Briggs called, his voice barely above a whisper. "Going twice." Silence stretched across the square like held breath. "Sold," Briggs finally managed, "to Sheriff Morrison for $500. Jake reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, the weight of it representing 3 years of careful saving. Gold coins caught the morning sunlight as he counted them out, each one falling into Briggs' palm with a soft clink that seemed to echo across the silent square. The crowd began to disperse, voices rising in speculation and confusion. What did the sheriff want with the mute girl? Why had he paid such an extraordinary sum? The questions would follow this day for years to come, but Jake ignored them all. He walked to the courthouse steps where Rebecca Hayes waited, her brown eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that made him feel like she could see straight through to his soul. When he reached her, he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "I'm Sheriff Jake Morrison. You're under my protection now." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, surprise perhaps, or the first tentative stirring of hope. Then she nodded once, a small, precise gesture that somehow conveyed both gratitude and wariness. As they walked away from the courthouse square, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something in motion that would change both their lives forever. He didn't know yet that the mute girl walking beside him held the key to his brother's murder. He didn't know that her silence was a shield protecting secrets that could destroy the most powerful men in the territory. All he knew was that Rebecca Hayes needed protection, and something deep in his chest told him that protecting her might be the most important thing he'd ever do. The morning sun climbed higher as they left the square behind, casting long shadows across the dusty street. In the distance, thunder rumbled like a promise of storms to come. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The sheriff's office sat at the heart of Redwood Falls, like a fortress of order in a frontier town that had seen too much chaos. Jake Morrison led Rebecca Hayes through the heavy oak door, past the gun rack and wanted posters that decorated the walls, toward the small living quarters he'd built behind his office. The arrangement wasn't ideal, but it was practical. As the only lawman in a territory that stretched 50 miles in every direction, Jake needed to be close to his work. The living space consisted of a modest sitting room, a kitchen barely large enough for 2 people, and 2 bedrooms separated by a narrow hallway. It wasn't much, but it was clean, secure, and most importantly, it offered protection. Rebecca moved through the space with the careful attention of someone cataloging escape routes and potential threats. Jake watched her take inventory of the windows, the doors, the distance between rooms. She was thinking like someone who'd learned that survival depended on always having an exit strategy. "The back room is yours," Jake said, gesturing toward the smaller of the 2 bedrooms. "There's a lock on the door, and the window opens onto the back alley if you ever need to get out quick." He paused, studying her face. "I don't expect you'll need to, but a woman should have options." Rebecca nodded, then moved to examine the room he'd indicated. Jake had hastily prepared it that morning after deciding to attend the auction, though he hadn't known then why he felt compelled to go. The bed was simple but clean, with quilts his late mother had made. A small dresser stood beneath the window, and he'd added a chair and a wash basin. When she emerged, Rebecca carried herself differently. The room had a lock, an escape route, and privacy. For someone who'd spent 6 months as a ward of the county, sleeping in the courthouse basement or wherever else the officials deemed appropriate, it must have felt like luxury. Jake moved to the kitchen and began preparing coffee, more to give his hands something to do than from any real desire for the drink. The events of the morning had left him shaken in ways he didn't fully understand. $500 was a fortune, representing years of careful saving from his sheriff's salary. He'd spent it without hesitation, driven by instincts he couldn't explain. "I know you can't talk," he said, measuring coffee grounds into the pot, "but I want you to understand something. The contract gives me legal authority over your work and living arrangements for the next 5 years, but I'm not interested in owning anybody. Far as I'm concerned, you're a guest who helps with household chores in exchange for room and board." Rebecca had positioned herself near the kitchen entrance, close enough to hear but far enough away to run if necessary. Jake noticed she kept her back to the wall, never allowing anyone to approach from behind. These were the habits of someone who'd learned that danger could come from any direction. "There are some rules," Jake continued, pouring water into the coffee pot. "First, you don't leave town without telling me. It's not about control. There are dangerous men in these parts, and I need to know where you are in case trouble finds you. Second, if anyone bothers you, anyone at all, you come straight to me. I don't care who they are or what they think they're entitled to." He set the coffee pot on the stove and turned to face her directly. "Third, and this is important, if you remember anything about what happened to you, about the wagon train attack or anything before that, you tell me. Even if you can't speak, you can write. Those memories might be the key to finding the people who hurt you." Something flickered in Rebecca's eyes at the mention of the wagon train attack. Not fear exactly, but a sharpening of attention that told Jake his words had hit close to home. She knew more about what had happened than the official reports suggested. The coffee began to bubble on the stove, filling the small kitchen with its rich aroma. Jake pulled 2 cups from the cupboard, then paused as he realized he didn't know if Rebecca even drank coffee. There were so many things he didn't know about her. Her preferences, her background, even her real name. Rebecca Hayes was what the county clerk had written on the forms, but it might as well have been Jane Doe for all the information it contained. "Can you write?" he asked. Rebecca nodded once, then held up her hands. Her fingers were ink-stained, and Jake could see the calluses that came from holding a pen for long periods. Someone had taught her well, which suggested an education beyond what most frontier girls received. Jake moved to his desk and retrieved paper and pencil, setting them on the kitchen table. "Maybe you could tell me how you take your coffee. Or if you even want coffee." Rebecca approached the table cautiously, picked up the pencil, and wrote in careful script, "Black coffee is fine. Thank you for your kindness, Sheriff Morrison." Her handwriting was precise and elegant, the kind taught in expensive schools back east. Jake studied the words, adding another piece to the puzzle of Rebecca Hayes. This wasn't some poor farmer's daughter who'd been traveling west with her family. The education, the refined penmanship, even the way she carried herself despite her circumstances, it all suggested someone from a very different background. "Where did you learn to write like that?" Jake asked. Rebecca hesitated, then wrote, "I attended a finishing school in Philadelphia before my family moved west." Philadelphia. That was serious money, the kind of education reserved for daughters of wealthy merchants or professional men. What was a Philadelphia finishing school graduate doing alone on the frontier? Apparently the sole survivor of a wagon train attack. Jake poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of Rebecca. She wrapped her hands around the warm cup with obvious pleasure, suggesting she'd been cold for longer than just this morning. When she tasted it, her eyes closed briefly in what looked like genuine appreciation. "How long since you had decent coffee?" Jake asked. Rebecca wrote, 6 months. The county provided what they called coffee, but it was mostly chicory and burnt. A grain. 6 months of institutional care, sleeping in basement cells and eating whatever scraps the county deemed adequate. Jake felt anger building in his chest as he imagined what she'd endured. The territorial authorities were supposed to provide for wards of the state, but adequate care often meant little more than keeping someone alive until they could be disposed of. "What happened to your family?" Jake asked gently. "The wagon. Train attack. Were you really the only survivor?" Rebecca's hands stilled on her coffee cup. For a long moment, she stared into the dark liquid as if it might contain answers to questions she couldn't voice. When she finally picked up the pencil, her writing was slower, more deliberate. "There were 12 wagons when we left Independence. Mine was the last one. When the attack came, I hid in the creek bed and watched." She paused, then added, "I wasn't supposed to survive." The word sent a chill through Jake that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. She wasn't supposed to survive. That suggested the attack hadn't been random. It had been targeted, planned, with specific goals in mind, and Rebecca Hayes had seen something she wasn't meant to see. "Who attacked the wagon train?" Jake asked. Rebecca's pencil hovered over the paper for a long time before she wrote, "Men I recognized, men who knew my family was traveling that route." Jake set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, his mind racing through the implications. If Rebecca recognized the attackers, if she could identify them, then her survival wasn't just miraculous, it was dangerous, for her and potentially for anyone who tried to protect her. "Is that why you can't speak?" he asked quietly. "Because of what you saw?" Rebecca nodded slowly, then wrote, "Dr. Henley says there's nothing wrong with my voice, but every time I try to speak, I see their faces again. I hear the screaming." Jake had seen men come back from the war with similar conditions, soldiers who'd witnessed horrors that left them unable to function normally. The mind protected itself by shutting down certain abilities, building walls around traumatic memories. But those walls could be breached, given time and safety. "The men you recognized," Jake said carefully, "are they still alive?" Rebecca's eyes met his across the table, and in them he saw fear, anger, and something that might have been hope. She wrote, "Yes, and they're here, in Redwood Falls." The words hit Jake like a physical blow. The men who'd murdered an entire wagon train were living in his town, walking his streets, possibly sitting in his jail cells or drinking in his saloons. They'd been here for 6 months, while Rebecca remained silent, terrified, and powerless. But now she was under his protection. Now she had someone who could act on what she'd witnessed. The question was whether she'd be able to identify them, and whether Jake would be able to bring them to justice before they realized their witness was no longer safely locked away in the county's care. "We'll start slow," Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet determination that had served him well as sheriff. "When you're ready, when you feel safe enough, you can tell me what you saw. We'll find these men, and we'll make them pay for what they did." Rebecca wrote one more line. "What if they find out I'm here first?" It was a valid question, one that Jake had been asking himself since the moment he'd made his bid. By taking Rebecca under his protection, he'd painted a target on both their backs. The men who'd killed 12 wagon loads of innocent people wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a witness, especially one who could identify them. But Jake had spent 5 years keeping the peace in a territory where violence was as common as prairie grass. He'd faced down claim jumpers, horse thieves, and killers of every stripe. The difference now was that he wasn't just protecting the law. He was protecting someone who mattered to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "They won't," Jake said simply. "I give you my word on that." Outside, the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows across the main street of Redwood Falls. Somewhere in this town, killers walked free, unaware that their past had just caught up with them, in the form of a mute girl with intelligent brown eyes and dangerous secrets. The game was about to change, and Jake Morrison intended to make sure he was the one holding the winning hand when it was over. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Redwood Falls, Jake Morrison sat at his desk, reviewing 3 years' worth of unsolved cases. The oil lamp cast flickering light across wanted posters, witness statements, and crime scene sketches that had yielded no answers. But Rebecca's revelations had changed everything. If killers were hiding in plain sight in his town, then perhaps other crimes weren't as random as they'd appeared. Rebecca had retreated to her room after their afternoon conversation, overwhelmed by the day's events and the weight of secrets she'd carried alone for 6 months. Jake could hear her moving about quietly, organizing her few possessions in the dresser drawers. The county had provided her with little more than 2 spare dresses and basic necessities. Tomorrow, he'd take her to Martha Patterson's dress shop to get proper clothing, though he'd have to be careful about drawing attention to their arrangement. A knock at the front door interrupted his thoughts. Jake glanced toward Rebecca's room. Noting that her movements had stopped, she was listening, alert to potential danger, even in what should have been a safe space. He moved to the window and peered through the curtain to see Deputy Tom Fletcher. Standing on the porch, his young face creased with worry. Jake opened the door to find his deputy shifting nervously from foot to foot. Tom was barely 22, eager to prove himself but still green around the edges. He'd been hired 6 months ago when the town council finally agreed that Redwood Falls needed more than one lawman to keep the peace. "Sheriff, we got a problem," Tom said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "Mayor Blackwood wants to see you tonight. Says it's urgent." Jake felt his jaw tighten. Mayor Harrison Blackwood was a politician first and a public servant second, the kind of man who measured every decision by its impact on his own interests. If he was demanding a meeting after the day's auction, it meant someone had complained about Jake's unprecedented bid. "What's he want to discuss?" Jake asked, though he already knew the answer. "The girl you bought today. Folks are talking, Sheriff. They're saying it ain't proper for an unmarried man to have a young woman living in his quarters. They're saying it looks—" Tom paused, searching for diplomatic words. "It looks questionable." Jake had expected this. In a town the size of Redwood Falls, gossip traveled faster than wildfire, and his actions at the auction had provided enough fuel to keep tongues wagging for months. But he'd hoped for at least one night before the politicians started circling. "Tell the mayor I'll see him in the morning," Jake said. "I've got work to catch up on tonight." Tom shifted uncomfortably. "He said to tell you it wasn't a request, Sheriff. He's waiting in his office now, along with some of the town council members." The threat was clear enough. Jake served at the pleasure of the town council, and if enough of them decided his behavior was inappropriate, they could remove him from office. But Jake had faced down worse threats than small-town politics, and he wasn't about to abandon Rebecca to satisfy a few narrow-minded busybodies. "Fine," Jake said, reaching for his hat. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. After Tom left, Jake knocked gently on Rebecca's door. When she opened it, he could see tension in every line of her body. She'd heard enough to understand that trouble was brewing. "I have to go out for a while," Jake said quietly. "There's a rifle above the fireplace if you need it, and extra ammunition in the desk drawer. Lock the doors behind me and don't open them for anyone except me or Deputy Fletcher." Rebecca nodded, then quickly wrote on a piece of paper, "Are they going to make you send me away?" The question cut straight to Jake's deepest concern. If the town council demanded he remove Rebecca from his quarters, he'd have few options. The county would reclaim custody, putting her back in the basement cell where she'd been stored like unwanted furniture. Or worse, they might decide to auction her contract again, this time to men who wouldn't be deterred by a sheriff's protection. "Not if I can help it," Jake said. "But Rebecca, if something happens to me, if they try to take you somewhere you don't want to go, you run. You hear me? You get out of town, and you don't stop until you find someone you can trust." Rebecca's eyes widened with alarm. She wrote quickly, "Who would I trust? How would I know?" It was a fair question. In her experience, authority figures had failed to protect her, and strangers had proven dangerous. Jake thought for a moment, then wrote an address on a piece of paper. "If you can't stay here, go to this place. It's a ranch about 20 miles north, owned by a woman named Elizabeth Carter. She's a widow who runs cattle and doesn't take nonsense from anybody. Tell her Jake Morrison sent you, and she'll keep you safe until we can figure out what comes next." Rebecca studied the address, then looked up at him with an expression that mixed gratitude with fear. She wrote, "Why are you helping me? What do you really want?" Jake had been asking himself the same question since the moment he'd opened his mouth to bid at the auction. The easy answer was that he couldn't stand by and watch an innocent person be victimized. But the truth was more complicated, tangled up with guilt over his brother's unsolved murder, and a growing certainty that Rebecca's presence in his life wasn't coincidental. "I think you might have answers to questions I've been asking for 3 years, Jake said honestly. "But even if you don't, even if you never remember anything useful, you deserve better than what was waiting for you at that auction." Mayor Blackwood's office occupied the 2nd floor of the town's largest bank, a position that reflected both his financial interests and his political aspirations. Jake climbed the narrow stairs, noting the expensive carpet and imported furniture that decorated the waiting area. The mayor's tastes ran toward ostentation, funded by his family's mining investments and his own talent for profitable real estate deals. The office itself was a monument to self-importance, with mahogany paneling, leather-bound books that had never been read, and a massive desk that dwarfed everything else in the room. Mayor Blackwood sat behind this fortress of polished wood, flanked by 3 town council members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Harrison Blackwood was a man of average height but above average ambition, with carefully groomed grey hair and the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. He'd been mayor for 8 years, elected on promises of bringing civilization and prosperity to Redwood Falls. He'd delivered on both counts, but always in ways that benefited his own interests first. "Sheriff Morrison," Blackwood said, not bothering, to rise from his chair. "Thank you for coming. Please have a seat." Jake remained standing. In his experience, politicians felt more comfortable when they could look down on the people they were trying to intimidate. "You wanted to see me about something?" "Indeed I do." Blackwood leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with the calculating gaze of a man who was used to getting his way. "Your actions at today's auction have raised some concerns among the citizenry. Specifically, your decision to spend an extraordinary sum on a mute girl of questionable background." "My money, my choice," Jake said evenly. "Nothing illegal about bidding at a public auction. Perhaps not illegal, but certainly questionable from a moral standpoint." This came from Councilman Edgar Thorne, a thin, nervous man who owned the town's largest general store. "The appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as actual impropriety, Sheriff. A young woman living in an unmarried man's quarters raises uncomfortable questions." Jake let his gaze move from face to face, reading the mixture of genuine concern and political calculation in their expressions. These men were worried about their own reputations as much as his, afraid that scandal might damage their standing in territorial politics. "The girl needs protection," Jake said simply. "She's a witness to serious crimes, and there are men in this territory who'd kill her to keep her quiet." "What crimes?" Blackwood leaned forward, his interest sharpening. "The official report says she was found wandering after a wagon train attack. Random violence by hostile Indians, most likely." Jake made a split-second decision that would change everything. Rebecca had trusted him with her secrets, and now he had to decide how much to reveal to protect her. "It wasn't Indians," he said quietly. "It was white men. Men she recognized. Men who might be living right here in Redwood Falls." The silence that followed was thick with implications. If Jake was right, if the wagon train massacre had been committed by local residents, then the political ramifications would be enormous. Territorial authorities would descend on the town, investigations would begin, and reputations would be destroyed. "That's a serious accusation," Blackwood said carefully. "Do you have proof?" "I have a witness," Jake replied. "A witness who can identify the killers if we can find a way to help her remember." Councilman Samuel Wright, who'd been silent until now, cleared his throat nervously. Wright was a banker, a careful man who understood that certain truths were more dangerous than comfortable lies. "Sheriff, perhaps it would be better to let sleeping dogs lie. The territorial authorities investigated the wagon train attack and concluded it was random violence. Reopening that case could bring unwanted attention to our community." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. These men weren't concerned about justice or truth. They were worried about protecting their own interests. If the killers were prominent citizens, if investigating the massacre would damage the town's reputation or threaten profitable business relationships, they'd rather let murderers walk free than risk the consequences of exposure. 12 families died in that attack, Jake said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had kept the peace for 5 years. Men, women, children. They deserve justice, no matter how inconvenient it might be. Justice is a luxury we can't always afford, Blackwood said bluntly. This town has worked hard to build a reputation for stability and prosperity. We can't let that be destroyed by ancient history and the unreliable memories of a traumatized girl. The mayor stood and moved to the window, gazing down at the main street where business owners were closing their shops for the night. I'm going. To be direct with you, Sheriff, the town council has discussed your situation, and we've reached a decision. The girl cannot remain in your quarters. It's inappropriate, and it's damaging to both your reputation and the town's. Jake felt his hands clench into fists. And where exactly do you suggest she go? The county will resume responsibility for her care, Thorne said quickly. I'm sure they can find appropriate placement. You mean sell her to whoever's willing to pay, Jake said flatly. She'll end up in Crawford's brothel or Ketchum's ranch, and within a year she'll be dead. Is that the kind of justice this town council supports? Blackwood turned from the window, his expression hardening. Your emotional attachment to this girl is clouding your judgment, Sheriff. The council has made its decision. You have 24 hours to make alternative arrangements for Miss Hayes, or will be forced to consider whether you're still fit to serve as sheriff of Redwood Falls. The ultimatum hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Jake understood the choice he was being offered: abandon Rebecca and keep his job, or protect her and lose his badge. It wasn't really a choice at all. I'll give you my answer tomorrow, Jake said, moving toward the door. Sheriff, Blackwood called after him, I hope you'll make the right decision, for everyone's sake. Jake paused in the doorway, his hand on the knob. Mayor, I've been making the right decisions for 5 years. I don't plan to stop now. As Jake walked back through the darkened streets of Redwood Falls, he realized that everything had changed. Rebecca's revelation about recognizing the killers had put them both in danger, not just from the murderers themselves, but from the very people who were supposed to protect justice and order. The town council's reaction told him everything he needed to know. They were more interested in protecting their comfortable lies than confronting dangerous truths, which meant that whatever came next, Jake and Rebecca would be facing it alone. But as he approached the sheriff's office, Jake saw a light burning in Rebecca's window and felt something strengthen in his chest. Some battles were worth fighting, regardless of the cost. Some people were worth protecting, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new choices. But tonight, Rebecca Hayes was safe under his roof, and Jake Morrison was still the sheriff of Redwood Falls. How long either of those things would remain true was anyone's guess. Dawn came early to Redwood Falls, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold as Jake Morrison made his morning rounds. He'd barely slept, his mind churning through the town council's ultimatum and the growing certainty that Rebecca's presence had awakened something dangerous in his normally peaceful town. As he walked the empty streets, checking doors and ensuring the night had passed without incident, he found himself studying familiar buildings with new eyes. Somewhere in this town lived the men who had murdered 12 families. They'd walked these same streets for 6 months, confident in their safety, secure in the knowledge that their only witness was locked away and silenced. Now that witness was under Jake's protection, and the killers would soon realize their comfortable anonymity was about to end. When Jake returned to the sheriff's office, he found Rebecca already awake, dressed in her simple gray dress and sitting at the kitchen table with paper and pencil. She'd been writing, her elegant script covering several pages with what looked like a detailed account. When she saw him, she quickly gathered the papers and held them out. I tried to remember everything she had written at the top of the first page. Names, faces, conversations I overheard. I think some of it might be important. Jake poured himself coffee and sat down to read Rebecca's account. Her handwriting was steady despite the traumatic nature of what she was describing, each word carefully chosen and precisely formed. As he read, a picture emerged that was far more complex and sinister than a simple wagon train robbery. According to Rebecca's recollection, her family hadn't been random travelers heading west. Her father, Dr. Jonathan Hayes, had been summoned to Redwood Falls specifically to provide medical testimony in a territorial land dispute. He'd examined several bodies that had been exhumed from unmarked graves, deaths that had been attributed to disease but which his professional examination had revealed to be poisonings. The Hayes family had been traveling under assumed names for their own protection, carrying Dr. Hayes's medical findings and sworn testimony to the territorial capital. Someone had learned of their mission and arranged for the wagon train to be attacked at a specific location where the killers could ensure no witnesses survived. Except Rebecca had survived, hidden in the creek bed, watching as men she'd seen in Redwood Falls systematically murdered everyone in the wagon train. She'd recognized faces, heard voices, witnessed the methodical way they'd searched through her father's belongings for his medical reports and testimony. "My God," Jake whispered as he finished reading. "Your father was murdered because he could prove other murders." Rebecca nodded, then wrote quickly, "The men who hired him didn't know he'd made copies of everything. He hid duplicates in our wagon before we left Philadelphia, sewn into the lining of my mother's trunk." Jake looked up sharply. "The trunk? Where is it now?" Rebecca's face went pale as she wrote, "The county stored our belongings in the courthouse basement. But Sheriff, if those men find out what my father discovered, if they realize there are copies of his reports..." She didn't need to finish the thought. If the killers learned that evidence of their crimes still existed, they'd stop at nothing to retrieve it. And anyone who stood in their way would meet the same fate as Dr. Jonathan Hayes and his family. Jake stood and moved to the window, studying the street with new wariness. Every passerby became a potential threat, every familiar face a possible enemy. For 6 months, he'd been the sheriff of a town harboring murderers, and he'd never suspected a thing. "We need to get to that trunk," Jake said quietly. "But first, I need to know who you recognized. Can you describe them?" Rebecca's hand trembled slightly as she wrote. "One was tall, with a grey beard and a scar on his left hand. He wore expensive clothes and spoke like an educated man. The others called him Judge." Jake felt his blood turn to ice. Judge Cornelius Whitman was one of the most respected men in the territory, a federal appointee who presided over land disputes and territorial legal matters. He owned a large ranch outside town and was known for his fair judgments and charitable works. The idea that he could be a cold-blooded killer seemed impossible. But Rebecca wasn't finished. Her next description was of a shorter man, with thinning hair and nervous habits, who'd directed the search through the wagons. Someone called Mayer, who'd been particularly interested in finding Dr. Hayes's medical bag and papers. Mayor Harrison Blackwood, the same man who'd threatened Jake's job the night before, who'd been so eager to keep the past buried and avoid unwanted attention from territorial authorities. The final description chilled Jake to the bone, a younger man with military bearing, who'd seemed to enjoy the killing, someone the others had called Captain. The description matched perfectly with Captain William Morrison, Jake's own brother Daniel, who'd been found murdered 3 years ago. Rebecca wrote one final line. Captain tried to stop them at the end. He said killing children was wrong. That's when the judge shot him." Jake's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor as the truth hit him like a physical blow. Daniel hadn't been murdered by random criminals or claim jumpers. He'd been killed by his own partners in crime because he'd developed a conscience too late to save anyone, but too soon to save himself. For 3 years, Jake had mourned his brother as an innocent victim. Now he learned that Daniel had been one of the killers, complicit in the massacre of 12 families before his own moral awakening led to his death. The brother Jake had idolized, whose murder had driven him to become sheriff, had been a participant, In the very crimes Jake now sought to solve. Rebecca was watching his face with growing alarm. She wrote quickly, "Sheriff, what's wrong? Did I say something?" "The captain you described," Jake said, his voice hoarse with shock. "His full name was Daniel Morrison. He was my brother." Understanding dawned in Rebecca's eyes, followed by something that looked like compassion. She'd lost her entire family to these killers, yet she felt sympathy for Jake's discovery that his brother had been one of them. A knock at the door interrupted the moment. Jake moved cautiously to the window and saw Deputy Fletcher on the porch, but something was wrong. Tom's usual eager demeanor had been replaced by nervous tension, and he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Jake opened the door, but kept his hand near his gun. "Morning, Tom. You're early." "Sheriff, we got trouble," Tom said, stepping inside quickly and closing the door behind him. "I was making my rounds this morning when I overheard Judge Whitman talking to Mayor Blackwood behind the courthouse. They were discussing Miss Hayes." Jake felt every muscle in his body tense. "What kind of discussion?" "They know she can write." "Sheriff, somehow they found out she's been communicating with you." Judge Whitman was saying they couldn't afford to let her remember too much, that she might become a problem that needed to be handled. The euphemism sent ice through Jake's veins. These men had killed an entire wagon train to protect their secrets. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate one inconvenient witness. "There's more," Tom continued, his young face pale with worry. "They're planning to use your refusal to give up Miss Hayes as grounds for removing you from office. They've called an emergency town council meeting for this afternoon, and they're bringing in territorial marshals to oversee the transition." Jake understood the trap now. If he refused to surrender Rebecca, they'd remove him from office and appoint someone more cooperative as sheriff. If he gave her up, she'd disappear within hours, another victim of men who saw murder as a business expense. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They assumed Jake would play by their rules, would accept their legal maneuvering and political pressure as legitimate authority. They'd forgotten that before he was a sheriff, Jake Morrison had been a soldier, and soldiers understood that sometimes the only way to win was to change the rules of engagement. "Tom," Jake said quietly, "how well do you know the territorial marshal service?" "Pretty well. My cousin serves with Marshal Davidson's district." "Why?" "Because I think it's time we brought in some federal authority that isn't compromised by local politics." Jake moved to his desk and began writing rapidly. "I need you to ride to Millbrook and find Marshal Davidson. Give him this letter and tell him it's a matter of territorial security." As Jake wrote, he outlined everything Rebecca had revealed about the wagon train massacre, the cover-up of previous murders, and the involvement of Judge Whitman and Mayor Blackwood. He requested immediate federal intervention and protection for a key witness whose life was in imminent danger. "This could take days," Tom said, studying the letter. "What if they move against you before I get back?" Jake looked toward Rebecca, who was watching their conversation with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. She understood enough to know that her presence had put them all at risk, that Jake was preparing for a confrontation that might cost him everything. "Then we'll handle it," Jake said simply. "Just get that letter to Marshal Davidson and tell him that if anything happens to me or Miss Hayes, he should look very carefully at the men running this town." After Tom left, Jake sat down across from Rebecca and studied her face. In less than 24 hours, she'd gone from being a voiceless victim to the key witness in a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of territorial government. The weight of that responsibility was enormous, especially for someone who'd already lost everything once. "I know this is overwhelming," Jake said gently. "But Rebecca, what you remember, what your father discovered, it's the only way to stop these men from killing again." Rebecca picked up her pencil and wrote, "They'll kill us both before they let the truth come out." "Maybe," Jake acknowledged, But they've been getting away with murder for years because they thought they were untouchable. Now they know there's a witness and they're scared. Scared men make mistakes. Rebecca studied his face for a long moment, then wrote, "What do we do?" Jake stood and moved to the gun cabinet, checking his rifle and pistol with the methodical care of a man preparing for war. "First, we get your father's evidence from the courthouse basement. Then we find a safe place to hide it until Marshal Davidson arrives. After that—" He paused, meeting Rebecca's eyes across the small room. "After that, we see just how far these men are willing to go to protect their secrets." Outside, the sun climbed higher over Redwood Falls, painting the town in deceptively peaceful golden light. But beneath the surface, forces were gathering that would soon transform the quiet frontier community into a battleground where truth and justice would face their ultimate test. The mute girl who'd stood on the auction block just yesterday was about to find her voice. And when she did, the words she spoke would shake the foundations of everything the powerful men of Redwood Falls had built on blood and lies. The question was whether she and Jake Morrison would live long enough to be heard. The courthouse basement reeked of dampness and decay, its stone walls weeping moisture from decades of mountain winters. Jake Morrison descended the narrow stairs with Rebecca close behind, both of them moving with the careful silence of people who understood that discovery meant death. The basement served as storage for county records, evidence from closed cases, and the personal effects of those who died without family to claim them. Jake carried a hooded lantern that cast dancing shadows across towers of wooden crates and canvas-wrapped bundles. Somewhere in this underground maze lay the trunk containing Dr. Hayes's duplicate medical reports, evidence that could expose years of systematic murder and bring down some of the most powerful men in the territory. "Stay close," Jake whispered, though the basement appeared empty. "If we're separated, head straight for the stairs and don't look back." Rebecca nodded, her eyes wide as she took in the overwhelming collection of stored belongings. Finding one specific trunk among hundreds of containers would be like searching for a particular grain of sand on a beach. But they had to try. It was their only chance of obtaining proof that would convince territorial authorities. Jake began systematically, checking the wooden tags attached to each storage area, looking for anything marked with the date of the wagon train massacre. The county clerk was methodical in his record-keeping, organizing items by date of acquisition and type of case. Personal effects from unidentified victims would be stored separately from evidence in active investigations. After 20 minutes of searching, Rebecca tugged on Jake's sleeve and pointed toward a corner where several large trunks sat beneath dust-covered canvas. The tags were faded, but Jake could make out dates from 6 months ago. His pulse quickened as he lifted the canvas and revealed 3 ornate traveling trunks, of the quality that wealthy Eastern families used for extended journeys. The first trunk contained men's clothing of fine quality, suits tailored in Philadelphia, silk vests and leather boots that had never seen hard labor. These had belonged to Dr. Hayes, a successful physician who could afford the best of everything. Jake felt a stab of guilt as he handled the dead man's possessions, knowing that his own brother had participated in their owner's murder. The second trunk held women's clothing, delicate fabrics, and careful stitching that spoke of wealth and refinement. Rebecca's hands trembled as she touched a blue silk dress that had obviously belonged to her mother. Jake watched emotions play across her face. Grief, loss, and a determination that hardened her features into something formidable. The third trunk was smaller, designed for a young woman's traveling needs. Inside, Jake found dresses suitable for someone Rebecca's age, along with books, writing materials, and personal mementos of a life that had been brutally cut short. But Rebecca was already running her hands along the trunk's lining, searching. for the hidden compartments her father had mentioned. "Here," she whispered, the first word Jake had heard her speak. The sound was barely audible, hoarse from months of disuse, but it was unmistakably her voice. Rebecca's eyes widened in shock at her own vocalization, but she didn't have time to process the breakthrough. Her fingers had found a section of lining that felt different from the rest. Jake helped her carefully peel back the fabric, revealing a waterproof pouch sewn into the trunk's interior. Inside were dozens of documents, medical reports, sworn, statements, sketches of exhumed bodies, and detailed notes in Dr. Hayes's precise handwriting. The evidence was everything Rebecca had promised and more. The medical reports made for grim reading. Dr. Hayes had examined 17 bodies from unmarked graves around Redwood Falls, all of them bearing signs of arsenic poisoning. The victims included homesteaders whose land had been claimed by mining interests, business owners who'd opposed certain development projects, and territorial officials who'd asked too many questions about mineral rights and land transfers. Each case had been ruled a natural death or accident at the time, but Dr. Hayes's professional examination revealed a pattern of systematic elimination. Someone had been murdering anyone who stood in the way of a massive land grab, using poison to avoid the attention that shootings or obvious violence would attract. The most damning document was a detailed map showing the locations of the poisoning. Victims, overlaid with surveying marks that indicated valuable mineral deposits. Every victim had owned property that contained gold, silver, or copper veins that were worth fortunes to anyone willing to kill for them. "My God," Jake breathed as he studied the map. "They've been murdering people for their mineral claims for years." Rebecca had found her voice again, though it remained weak and hoarse. "The judge, he owned the mining company that bought all the land after the deaths. Papa found the connection through territorial records." Jake's hands shook as he read through more documents. Judge Whitman hadn't just been covering up murders. He'd been orchestrating them, using his position to identify valuable claims, arranging for the owners to be poisoned, then purchasing the property at rock-bottom prices from grieving widows. Or estate sales. Mayor Blackwood had been his partner, using his political connections to ensure the deaths weren't investigated too closely and that the property transfers went through without scrutiny. Together, they'd built a fortune on systematic murder, confident that their positions protected them from any consequences. But Dr. Hayes had uncovered their scheme, and his medical testimony would have exposed everything. So they'd arranged for the wagon train massacre, making it look like a random attack, while ensuring that the dangerous evidence disappeared forever. "We need to get this to Deputy Fletcher," Jake said, carefully placing the documents back in their waterproof pouch. "If he's already reached Marshal Davidson." Footsteps echoed down the basement stairs, cutting off Jake's words. Someone was coming, moving with the confident stride of people who had every right to be there. Jake quickly extinguished the lantern and pulled Rebecca behind a stack of crates, pressing his finger to his lips for silence. Judge Whitman's voice carried clearly in the confined space. "The trunk should be over here somewhere. We should have retrieved it months ago, but we thought the girl was harmless." "She's been writing to the sheriff," came Mayor Blackwood's nervous response. "God knows what she's remembered, what she might have told him." "It doesn't matter what she's remembered," a third voice said coldly. Jake recognized Dr. Edmund Carlyle, the town's physician, and apparently another member of the conspiracy. "She won't be remembering anything much longer." Jake's blood ran cold as he understood the implication. They weren't just here for the evidence. They were planning to eliminate Rebecca permanently. His hand moved to his gun, but he was outnumbered, 3-1 in a confined space with poor visibility. A gunfight would likely get them both killed. The men moved through the basement methodically, their lantern lights sweeping across the stored belongings. Jake could hear them getting closer, and he knew it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. He leaned close to Rebecca's ear and whispered instructions for her escape route. "When I say run, you head straight for the stairs," he breathed. "Don't look back, don't wait for me. Get to Deputy Fletcher's cousin in Millbrook and tell him everything." Rebecca shook her head violently, her eyes wide with terror at the thought of being separated from her protector. But Jake knew their only chance was for one of them to escape with the evidence. The documents in her hands were worth more than both their lives. They could save future victims and bring justice for those already murdered. Judge Whitman's voice was getting closer. "Check those trunks over there. If Hayes hid anything, it would be in his family's belongings." Jake made his decision. Standing slowly, he stepped into the lantern light with his hands visible but ready to draw his weapon. "Evening, gentlemen. Fancy meeting you here." The three men froze, their faces cycling through surprise, calculation, and deadly intent. Judge Whitman recovered first, his judicial training allowing him to maintain composure even in unexpected situations. "Sheriff Morrison," Whitman said smoothly. "How fortuitous. We were just retrieving some evidence for a territorial investigation. Perhaps you'd like to assist us." "That depends," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "What kind of investigation involves three men sneaking around a basement after dark?" Dr. Carlyle's hand moved toward his coat, but Jake's gun was already in his palm. The motion so fast, it seemed like magic. "I wouldn't, Doc. This conversation is just getting interesting." Behind the crates, Rebecca clutched the evidence pouch and tried to control her breathing. She could hear every word, could feel the tension building toward an explosion of violence that would determine all their fates. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff," Mayor Blackwood said, his political instincts struggling to find an angle that might diffuse the situation. "We're conducting official business here." "Funny thing about official business," Jake said conversationally. "It usually involves paperwork, search warrants, that sort of thing. You gentlemen happen to have any of those?" The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Jake could see the calculations in their eyes, weighing their options and finding them. All wanting. They were exposed, caught in the act of destroying evidence, and they knew Jake understood exactly what that meant. Judge Whitman's facade finally cracked, revealing the cold-blooded killer beneath the judicial robes. "You should have minded your own business, Morrison, just like your brother should have kept his mouth shut." "My brother," Jake said quietly, "tried to do the right thing at the end. That's more than any of you can say." "Your brother was weak," Whitman snarled. "He couldn't stomach what needed to be done for progress. The weak always stand in the way of the strong, just like you're doing now." Jake smiled grimly. "Maybe, but the thing about being weak is that sometimes you get help from unexpected places." Before the judge could ask what he meant, Rebecca Hayes stepped into the lantern light, the evidence pouch held high in her hands. Her voice was stronger now, carrying clearly through the basement as she spoke for the first time in 6 months. "Federal Marshal Davidson is already on his way," she said, her words ringing with quiet authority. "Deputy Fletcher reached him yesterday, and these documents have already been copied and sent to the territorial capital. It was a bluff, but a convincing one." Jake felt pride surge through him as he watched Rebecca face down her family's killers with nothing but courage and intelligence. The mute girl, who'd stood terrified on the auction block, had found her voice at the moment when it mattered most. Judge Whitman's face went white as he realized that their carefully constructed empire of murder and corruption was crumbling around them. The evidence they'd killed to suppress was already beyond their reach, and federal authorities were coming to investigate. "You're lying," Dr. Carlyle said desperately, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Rebecca smiled for the first time since Jake had met her. "I guess we'll find out soon enough." In the tense silence that followed, Jake heard something that made his heart leap with hope, the sound of horses approaching the courthouse at a gallop. too many horses to be a coincidence, moving too fast to be casual travelers. Federal marshals moved differently than local law enforcement. They had authority that transcended political boundaries and connections that couldn't be bought or intimidated. If Deputy Fletcher had succeeded in his mission, help was about to arrive. The basement erupted into chaos as Judge Whitman made a desperate grab for his gun, triggering a confrontation that would determine whether justice or corruption would prevail in Redwood Falls. The gunshot echoed through the courthouse basement like thunder in a cave. Judge Whitman's bullet splintered the wooden crate beside Jake's head, sending fragments flying as the sheriff dove for cover. The confined space erupted into chaos as three desperate men fought for their freedom against a lawman who'd already seen too much. Jake rolled behind a stack of county records, his own pistol speaking twice in rapid succession. Dr. Carlyle cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. The physician who'd helped poison 17 innocent people had just learned what his victims felt like, helpless and afraid. "Rebecca, get down!" Jake shouted, but she was already moving with the survival instincts that had kept her alive during the wagon train massacre. She pressed herself against the stone wall, the evidence pouch clutched to her chest, watching the battle unfold with eyes that held no fear, only grim determination to see justice done. Mayor Blackwood had drawn a derringer, the small weapon, looking absurd in his soft politician's hands. He fired wildly, the bullet ricocheting off the stone walls in a shower of sparks. His face was pale with terror as he realized that all his political maneuvering and backroom deals meant nothing. In a gunfight, Judge Whitman was the real danger. He moved with the cold precision of a man who'd killed before, using the basement's shadows and obstacles like a trained soldier. His weapon was a military-issue Colt revolver, and he knew how to use it. Jake counted shots. The judge had 4 bullets left, enough to finish this fight if he used them wisely. "Give it up, Whitman!" Jake called out, reloading behind his barricade of records. "Those marshals upstairs have already surrounded the building. You've got nowhere to run." "Then we'll die fighting," Whitman snarled back. "Better than swinging." From a rope in front of half the territory, the judge's bullets began probing Jake's position, each shot calculated to force him into the open. Splinters flew as wood and paper disintegrated under the assault. Jake realized he was pinned down, unable to move without exposing himself to deadly fire. But Whitman had made a crucial mistake. In his focus on the sheriff, he'd forgotten about Rebecca Hayes, the witness whose testimony would destroy him, the survivor whose voice had finally returned. While the judge concentrated his fire on Jake's position, Rebecca was moving through the shadows with the stealth that had saved her life 6 months ago. She reached the basement stairs undetected, but instead of fleeing to safety as Jake had ordered, she did something that would be talked about in Redwood Falls for generations. Rebecca Hayes began to scream. Her voice, unused for months except for whispered words in crisis, erupted with the full force of 6 months' worth of suppressed terror, rage, and pain. The sound echoed through the courthouse, a primal cry that spoke of murdered families and buried truths and justice too long delayed. "Murderers!" she screamed, her voice carrying through the building's stone walls and wooden floors. "Murderers in the basement! They killed my family! They killed them! All!" The effect was immediate and devastating. Footsteps thundered above as people came running from all directions. The marshals Jake had heard arriving were real, but so were ordinary citizens who'd been gathered outside the courthouse, waiting for news of the emergency town council meeting. Judge Whitman's face went white as he realized his worst nightmare was coming true. Rebecca Hayes wasn't just speaking, she was bearing witness before half the town, destroying any hope of covering up their crimes. "Shut her up!" Whitman roared at Dr. Carlyle, but the wounded physician was in no condition to silence anyone. He slumped against a wooden crate, his face gray with shock and blood loss. Mayor Blackwood made a desperate rush toward the stairs, perhaps hoping to escape in the confusion or to silence Rebecca before she could say more. But Jake was ready for him. The sheriff's bullet caught the corrupt politician's center mass, spinning him around before he collapsed among the scattered county records he'd helped falsify over the years. "It's over, Whitman," Jake called out, advancing carefully through the maze of stored belongings. "Your partners are down, and the whole town knows what you've done. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see trial." The judge's laughter was bitter and defeated. "You think they'll believe her word against mine? I'm a federal appointee, Morrison. She's a traumatized girl who's been silent for 6 months. Who do you think they'll trust?" "They'll trust the evidence," Rebecca said, her voice growing stronger with each word. She held up the waterproof pouch containing her father's medical reports. 17 bodies, all showing signs of arsenic poisoning. Property records showing you bought their land for pennies after they died. Financial records proving you owned the mining company that profited from their deaths. Whitman's composure finally cracked completely. The facade of judicial dignity disappeared, revealing the cold-blooded killer he'd always been underneath. "You should have died with the rest of them. You should have stayed silent." "She was silent," Jake said, emerging from cover with his gun trained on the judge. "But you made a mistake. You let fear control your decisions. You could have left her alone, let her live quietly with her trauma. Instead, you got greedy. You got scared, and scared men make fatal errors." The sound of boots on the basement stairs interrupted the confrontation. Federal Marshal Davidson descended with 2 of his deputies, their weapons drawn and their faces grim. The marshal was a tall, weathered man with the kind of authority that came from years of dealing with frontier. "Justice." "Sheriff Morrison," Davidson called out, "we got your deputy's message. Looks like we arrived just in time." "Marshal Davidson," Jake replied, not taking his eyes off Whitman. "Perfect timing. Judge Whitman here was just about to surrender his weapon and submit to federal custody." For a moment it seemed like the judge might comply. His gun hand wavered, and something that might have been resignation flickered across his features. But then his gaze fell on the evidence pouch in Rebecca's hands, and desperation overtook reason. Whitman made one final desperate play. Instead of surrendering, he swung his gun toward Rebecca, gambling that he could eliminate the witness, even if it cost him his own life. His finger tightened on the trigger as he aimed at the young woman who'd survived one massacre and was determined to see justice for another. But Jake Morrison had been watching for exactly this move. His shot was perfect, catching Whitman's center mass and spinning him away from Rebecca before the judge could fire. The corrupt official crashed into a stack of legal documents, his blood staining the county records he'd helped corrupt over years of systematic murder. Judge Cornelius Whitman, federal appointee and serial killer, died surrounded by the evidence of his crimes and the testimony of the witness he'd failed to silence. The basement fell silent except for the sound of Dr. Carlisle's labored breathing and the footsteps of federal marshals securing the scene. Marshal Davidson holstered his weapon and moved to check on the wounded physician, while his deputies began collecting evidence and taking statements. "Miss Hayes," Davidson said gently, approaching Rebecca with the careful respect due a key witness. "I'm Marshal Davidson. Deputy Fletcher told me about your situation. Are you injured?" Rebecca shook her head, still clutching the evidence pouch that had cost so many lives to suppress. "I'm fine, Marshal, but there are others, people in town who helped them, who knew what was happening." "We'll get them all," Davidson assured her. "Federal investigators are already reviewing territorial records, and we have warrants for several other suspects. Your father's evidence will help us build cases that will stand up in any court." Jake holstered his weapon and moved to Rebecca's side, studying her face with concern. The basement confrontation had been brutal and traumatic, even for someone who'd already survived so much. But Rebecca Hayes looked different now, not broken or defeated, but determined and strong. "You found your voice," Jake said quietly. Rebecca smiled, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "I never lost it. I just needed something important enough to say." Marshal Davidson was examining Dr. Hayes's medical reports by lantern light, his experienced eye quickly recognizing their significance. "This is extraordinary work," he said with professional admiration. "Your father was a gifted physician and a brave man. His testimony will help convict everyone involved in this conspiracy." "What happens now?" Rebecca asked. "Now we clean house," Davidson replied grimly. "This conspiracy reaches into territorial government, federal appointments, and local business. Interests will be investigating for months, but we have enough evidence to start making arrests immediately." As they climbed out of the basement, Jake could hear the buzz of conversation from the crowd that had gathered outside the courthouse. Word of the confrontation was already spreading through Redwood Falls like wildfire. By morning, everyone in 3 counties would know that Judge Whitman and Mayor Blackwood had been exposed as murderers. The town council members who'd threatened Jake's job were notably absent from the crowd. Councilman Wright had disappeared sometime during the evening, and Councilman Thorne was reportedly packing his belongings for an extended trip to visit relatives back east. The political coalition that had protected the conspiracy was crumbling. As its members fled or sought deals with federal prosecutors, "Sheriff Morrison," Marshal Davidson said as they reached the courthouse steps, "I want to commend your work on this case. Without your protection of Miss Hayes and your investigation into these crimes, this conspiracy might have continued for years." Jake looked out at the crowd of townspeople, seeing a mixture of shock, anger, and relief in their faces. Redwood Falls had been living under the shadow of systematic murder for years without knowing it. Tonight, that shadow had finally been lifted. "Just doing my job, Marshal," Jake said simply. "No," Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly across the courthouse steps. "You did much more than that. You saved my life, gave me back my voice, and helped me find justice for my family." She turned to address the crowd, her words ringing with authority that commanded attention. "This man bid $500 to save me from a fate worse than death. He risked his career, his life, and everything he'd worked for to protect. Someone he'd never met. That's not just doing a job, that's being a hero." The crowd murmured its agreement, and Jake felt something shift in the way people looked at him. He was no longer just the sheriff who'd made an unusual bid at a debt auction. He was the lawman who'd exposed corruption, protected the innocent, and brought justice to a town that had forgotten what it looked like. As the federal marshals took control of the crime scene and began their investigation, Jake found himself standing beside Rebecca on the courthouse steps, watching the dawn break over Redwood Falls. The town looked the same as it had yesterday, but everything had changed. "What will you do now?" Jake asked quietly. Rebecca considered the question seriously. "I'll testify at the trials, help the marshals identify everyone involved in the conspiracy. After that..." She paused, studying the mountains that surrounded their valley. "I think I'd like to stay in Redwood Falls. It needs honest people to help rebuild what these men destroyed." Jake nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Redwood Falls needed people who understood the difference between justice and corruption, between protecting the innocent and exploiting the vulnerable. It needed people like Rebecca Hayes, who'd found the courage to speak truth to power when it mattered most. "The town could use a good teacher," Jake suggested. "Someone to help the children learn about justice and integrity." Rebecca smiled, the expression holding promise for a future neither of them had imagined 24 hours ago. "I'd like that. And the town could probably use a sheriff who understands the difference between law and justice." As the sun climbed higher over the mountains of Montana Territory, 2 survivors of different tragedies stood together on the courthouse steps, watching their community begin the long process of healing. The mute girl who'd been sold at auction had found her voice. The sheriff who'd lost faith in justice had found his purpose, and in the growing light of a new day, Redwood Falls began to remember what it meant to be a place where good people could live without fear. 3 days after the courthouse confrontation, Redwood Falls resembled a disturbed anthill as federal investigators swarmed through every office, business and residence connected to the conspiracy. Marshal Davidson had brought a team of 12 agents from the territorial capital, each one armed with warrants and the authority to tear apart decades of carefully constructed lies. Jake Morrison stood in his office, watching through the window as yet another prominent citizen was led away. In shackles. This time it was Samuel Wright, the banker who tried to convince Jake to let sleeping dogs lie. Wright's involvement had been deeper than anyone suspected. His bank had laundered money from the illegal mining operations and provided false financial records to support the cover-up of murders. 17 conspirators arrested so far, Rebecca said from her chair by the desk, reading from the latest federal report. Her voice had grown stronger each day, losing the hoarseness of disuse, and gaining the confidence of someone who knew her words carried weight. And they're still finding connections we never suspected. The scope of the conspiracy had shocked even experienced federal investigators. What had started as a simple land grab using poison to eliminate troublesome property owners had evolved into a territorial-wide network of corruption involving judges, politicians, business leaders, and even some federal officials. Dr. Hayes's medical evidence had been the key that unlocked everything. His meticulous documentation of poisoning victims had led investigators to examine dozens of other suspicious deaths across 3 counties. The pattern was always the same: valuable property owners dying suddenly of apparent natural causes, their land quickly purchased by shell companies connected to Judge Whitman's mining interests. Mrs. Patterson from the dress shop stopped by. "This morning," Rebecca continued, setting down the report, "she wanted to thank you again for exposing the truth about her husband's death." Jake nodded grimly. Thomas Patterson had been one of the poisoning victims, an honest merchant who'd opposed the construction of a smelting plant near the town's water supply. His widow had spent 2 years believing he'd died of a sudden heart condition, never knowing he'd been murdered for standing up to corrupt business interests. "That's the hardest part," Jake said, watching another arrest through the window. "All these families who thought they'd lost loved ones to accidents or illness. Finding out they were murdered changes everything." The psychological impact on Redwood Falls had been devastating. Neighbors looked at each other with suspicion, wondering who else might have been involved in the conspiracy. Businesses were failing as people boycotted anyone suspected of connections to the killers. The social fabric of the community had been torn apart by the revelation that respected leaders were cold-blooded murderers. But there were positive changes as well. Families of victims were finally getting answers and the possibility of justice. Property stolen through murder was being returned to rightful heirs. Most importantly, the systematic killing had stopped, and people could speak out against corruption without fearing for their lives. A knock at the door interrupted Jake's thoughts. Marshal Davidson entered with a thick folder of documents and the weary expression of a man who'd been working around the clock for days. "Sheriff, Miss Hayes," Davidson said, settling into a chair with obvious relief. "I wanted to update you on the investigation's progress and discuss some developments that affect you both directly." Rebecca leaned forward with interest. Over the past 3 days, she'd become an integral part of the federal investigation, her memories of the wagon train massacre providing crucial details that helped investigators understand the conspiracy's full scope. "We've arrested everyone connected to your family's murder," Davidson told Rebecca. "The 4 men who participated in the actual attack are all in custody, along with the people who planned and financed the operation. Your testimony will be crucial in ensuring they face justice. What about the federal officials Judge Whitman mentioned? Jake asked. He said he had connections in the territorial government. Davidson's expression darkened. We're still investigating, but it appears Whitman was exaggerating his influence to impress his local partners. We've found evidence of bribery, attempts, but no indication that any federal officials actually participated in the murders. The marshal pulled several documents from his folder. However, we have discovered something that directly concerns both of you. Sheriff Morrison, are you familiar with the circumstances of your brother Daniel's death? Jake felt his chest tighten. For 3 days, he'd been dreading this conversation, knowing that the federal investigation would eventually focus on Daniel's role in the conspiracy. I know he was involved with Whitman's group before he was killed. Rebecca's testimony made that clear. Your brother's involvement was more complex than we initially understood, Davidson said carefully. We found evidence that Daniel was actually working as an undercover investigator for the Territorial Marshal Service. The words hit Jake like a physical blow. What? Davidson spread several official documents across the desk. Daniel Morrison was recruited by federal authorities 6 months before his death to investigate suspicious mining claims and property transfers in this region. His assignment was to infiltrate the conspiracy and gather evidence of criminal activity. Rebecca's eyes widened as she understood the implications. He wasn't really one of them. He was trying to stop them. That's correct, Davidson confirmed. Daniel's participation in the wagon train massacre appears to have been his attempt to gather final evidence against the conspiracy. According to these reports, he was planning to contact federal authorities immediately after the attack with proof of their crimes. Jake's hands shook as he read through his brother's official correspondence with territorial investigators. Daniel had been gathering evidence for months, documenting the conspiracy's activities and building cases against its members. His apparent moral awakening during the massacre hadn't been a sudden change of heart. It had been the completion of his undercover mission. He tried to save my family, Rebecca said quietly, her voice heavy with emotion. That's why they killed him. Judge Whitman suspected Daniel was working for federal authorities, Davidson explained. After the massacre, when Daniel insisted they should stop killing innocent people, Whitman became convinced his suspicions were correct. He shot Daniel to prevent him from exposing the conspiracy. The revelation transformed Jake's understanding of everything that had happened. Daniel hadn't been a killer who developed a conscience. He'd been a federal agent who'd risked everything to bring murderers to justice. His death hadn't been the random crime Jake had spent 3 years trying to solve. It had been the assassination of an undercover investigator. Daniel's final report was supposed to be delivered to federal authorities after the wagon train operation. Davidson continued. When he failed to make contact, we assumed the assignment had failed and our agent was dead. It wasn't until Deputy Fletcher reached us with your message that we understood the connection. Rebecca reached across the desk and took Jake's hand, understanding the emotional weight of this revelation. For 3 years, Jake had carried guilt over his inability to solve his brother's murder, never knowing that Daniel had died as a hero rather than a victim. There's more, Davidson said, pulling out another set of documents. Daniel's investigation had identified most of the conspiracy's members, including several we hadn't yet arrested. His work will help us complete the prosecutions and ensure everyone involved faces justice. Jake studied his brother's handwriting on the investigative reports, seeing the careful documentation of crimes and the growing urgency in Daniel's notes as he realized the scope of the conspiracy. The final entries, written just days before the wagon train massacre, expressed concern that his cover might be compromised and determination to complete his mission regardless of personal risk. He saved a lot of lives, Jake said quietly. If the conspiracy had continued, How many more people would have been murdered for their property? Dozens, possibly hundreds, Davidson replied grimly. The mining interests were expanding rapidly, and Judge Whitman had identified valuable claims. Throughout the territory, your brother's sacrifice prevented years of systematic murder. The knowledge that Daniel had died as a federal agent rather than a criminal changed everything for Jake. The guilt and confusion he'd carried for 3 years began to transform into pride and understanding. Daniel hadn't abandoned his principles. He'd died defending them. What happens to the town now? Rebecca asked, looking toward the window where federal agents continued their work. How does a community recover from something like this? Davidson considered the question seriously. It takes time. New leadership, honest businesses, people willing to rebuild trust. Communities have recovered from worse, but it requires individuals committed to doing things the right way. The territorial governor has asked me to serve as interim mayor until special elections can be held, Jake said. I haven't given him an answer yet. Rebecca looked at him with surprise. You should accept. Redwood Falls needs someone who understands the difference between leadership and corruption. I'm a sheriff, not a politician, Jake protested. You're someone people trust, Rebecca countered. Someone who proved he'll stand up for what's right even when it costs him everything. That's exactly what this town needs. Davidson nodded his agreement. Miss Hayes is right. Redwood Falls needs leaders who've proven their integrity under pressure. Your actions during this investigation demonstrated the kind of moral courage the community needs to heal. Jake looked around his office, thinking about the choice before him. He could remain sheriff, enforcing law in a town that was slowly learning to trust authority again, or he could step into a larger role, helping guide Redwood Falls through its recovery and rebuilding. What about you? Jake asked Rebecca. Have you decided what you want to do? Rebecca smiled, the expression holding confidence and determination that had been missing when Jake first met her. The Territorial Education Department has offered me a position developing new curricula for frontier schools. They want someone who understands the importance of teaching children about justice and integrity. That's perfect, Jake said, genuinely. Pleased by the news. The position is based here in Redwood Falls, Rebecca continued. I'll be working with local schools throughout the territory, but this will be my home base. Someone needs to make sure the next generation learns from what happened here. Davidson gathered his documents and prepared to leave. I'll be submitting my final report to territorial authorities next week. Both of you will be commended for your service to federal law enforcement and your courage in exposing this conspiracy. After the marshal left, Jake and Rebecca sat in comfortable silence, processing the weight of everything they'd learned. Daniel's true role in the conspiracy, the scope of the investigation, and the challenges facing their community had given them much to consider. Do you think we can really rebuild this place? Rebecca asked. Make it somewhere good people want to live. Jake looked out at the town he'd sworn to protect, seeing past the current chaos to the potential that lay beneath. Redwood Falls had good land, honest citizens, and natural resources that could support a thriving community. What it needed was leadership committed to justice rather than profit. I think we can, Jake said finally. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But with the right people making the right choices, this could become the kind of place your father would have been proud to call home. Rebecca nodded, understanding that they were talking about more than just rebuilding a town. They were discussing the possibility of creating something better than what had been destroyed, a community founded on truth, justice, and the kind of moral courage that had brought them together. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains that surrounded Redwood Falls, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple. In the growing dusk, federal agents continued their work, dismantling the last remnants of a conspiracy that had cost so many lives. But inside the sheriff's office, two survivors were planning for a future neither had dared imagine just days before. The mute girl who'd found her voice was preparing to teach others to use theirs. The sheriff, who'd lost faith in justice, was ready to help rebuild it from the ground up. Together, they would help Redwood Falls remember what it meant to be a place where good people could live without fear. 2 years later, Rebecca Hayes stood at the window of her classroom in the newly constructed Redwood Falls Academy, watching the morning bustle of a town transformed beyond recognition. The main street that had once hosted a desperate debt auction now bustled with legitimate businesses run by honest merchants who'd moved to the territory specifically because of its reputation for integrity. Children played in a new park built where Judge Whitman's illegal mining office had once stood, their laughter carrying on the mountain air like a promise of better times ahead. The academy itself was a testament to the community's commitment to rebuilding from the ground up. Funded by the territorial government and private donations from across Montana, it stood as one of the finest educational institutions in the region. 3 stories of red brick and white limestone, with tall windows that let in the mountain light, and a bell tower that chimed the hours across the valley. Rebecca had designed the curriculum herself, emphasizing critical thinking, civic responsibility, and the moral courage needed to prevent future corruption. "Miss Hayes, are you ready for the ceremony?" Rebecca turned to see Emily Patterson, her teaching assistant and daughter of the merchant who'd been murdered by the conspiracy. Emily had been only 12 when her father died, but she'd grown into a strong young woman of 18, determined to honor his memory through education and service. She'd been Rebecca's first student to express interest in becoming a teacher herself, and would be starting her formal training at the Territorial College in the fall. "Almost," Rebecca replied, adjusting the blue dress she'd chosen for the occasion, a far cry from the faded grey garment she'd worn on the auction block. Today marked the 2nd anniversary of the conspiracy's exposure, and Redwood Falls was dedicating a memorial to the victims while celebrating how far the community had come in rebuilding itself. Through her window, Rebecca could see workers putting the finishing touches on the memorial plaza. 17 granite stones bore the names of the poisoning victims, each one polished to a mirror shine and engraved with dates of birth and death, along with brief descriptions of their contributions to the community. A larger monument honored the families lost in the wagon train massacre, including her own parents. At the center stood a bronze statue of a woman holding scales of justice in one hand and a quill pen in the other, a figure that many townspeople privately recognized as representing Rebecca herself, though she'd insisted on anonymity when the commission was approved. The symbolism was intentional and powerful. The scales represented justice finally served, while the pen symbolized the power of words to expose truth and create change. Children often played around the statue, and Rebecca had observed them asking their parents about its meaning, leading to conversations about civic duty and moral courage that would shape the next generation. A knock at the classroom door interrupted her thoughts. Mayor Jake Morrison entered with his characteristic quiet confidence, wearing the formal attire appropriate for his dual role in today's ceremony. He would speak both as the elected mayor who'd guided Redwood Falls through its difficult recovery, and as the brother of federal agent Daniel Morrison, whose heroic sacrifice was finally being publicly recognized after 2 years of federal secrecy requirements. "The territorial governor arrived an hour ago," Jake said, his eyes warm as they met Rebecca's. "Marshal Davidson is here too, along with several other federal officials. There's also a delegation from the territorial legislature. They're all eager to see what we've built." Rebecca smiled, feeling a familiar flutter whenever Jake looked at her that way. Their relationship had evolved slowly over the past 2 years, built on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than dramatic declarations of love. They'd both been too damaged by their pasts to rush into anything, but what had grown between them was solid and real and tested by the challenges they'd faced together. "Are you nervous?" she asked, noting the slight tension in his shoulders that she'd learned to read over countless shared conversations. "About the speech?" "No, about the other thing." Jake paused, his hand moving unconsciously to his jacket pocket. "That's different." Rebecca's heart skipped as she caught the implication. For weeks, she'd noticed Jake's increased nervousness, his careful attention to her schedule, the way he seemed to be building up to something important. She'd suspected what was coming, but the knowledge still sent excitement coursing through her veins. "The ceremony doesn't start for another hour," she said carefully. "Perhaps we could take a walk through the Memorial Plaza. I'd like to see how the final preparations are coming along." Jake's smile was answer enough. They walked through town together, noting the changes that had transformed Redwood Falls from a place of hidden corruption into a genuine community. The courthouse had been renovated inside and out, its basement converted into a public archive where citizens could review government records and court proceedings. The mayor's office operated with open books and public meetings, a stark contrast to Harrison Blackwood's secretive administration. Even the jail had been rebuilt with better conditions and transparent oversight. The economic transformation was equally dramatic. New businesses had opened as word spread that Redwood Falls was a place where honest entrepreneurs could succeed without paying bribes or facing corrupt competition. The Silver Dollar Saloon had been converted into a community center where town meetings were held. A new library occupied the building that had once housed the corrupt mining company's offices. Even the old debt auction site had been turned into a farmer's market where local producers sold their goods every Saturday morning. Most importantly, the people themselves had changed. They walked taller, spoke more freely, and engaged in civic life with the confidence of citizens who knew their voices mattered. The conspiracy's exposure had been traumatic, but it had also liberated a community from years of fear and hidden oppression. "Do you remember what you said that first day?" Jake asked, as they approached the Memorial Plaza. "About needing something important enough to say." Rebecca nodded, remembering the moment her voice had returned in the courthouse basement, breaking 6 months of silence with a scream that had exposed murderers and changed everything. "I never thanked you properly for giving me that chance." "You did thank me," Jake said quietly, "every day for 2 years in 100 different ways. Every time you stood up to speak at a town meeting, every time you encouraged a student to ask difficult questions, every time you chose courage over comfort." They stopped before the memorial stones, reading names that had become familiar through their work with victim families. Each name represented not just a life lost, but a family shattered, a future stolen by greed and corruption. Yet somehow, from this tragedy, hope had emerged and flourished. Thomas Patterson, beloved merchant and father; Dr. William Hendricks, physician and humanitarian; Samuel Crawford, homesteader and veteran; Margaret O'Brien, teacher and community organizer. The list continued, each name a story of someone who'd stood up for what was right and paid the ultimate price. But their deaths had not been in vain. They'd ultimately led to the exposure of the conspiracy and the transformation of an entire community. "Rebecca," Jake said, his voice carrying the formal tone he used for important announcements, but softened with emotion. 2 years ago, I paid $500 at an auction because I couldn't stand by and watch evil triumph over innocence. It was the best investment I ever made." He moved to stand directly in front of her, his hands taking hers with gentle certainty. "You've given me back my faith in justice, in community, in the possibility that good people can make a difference. You've shown me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's speaking truth despite being afraid." Rebecca felt tears gathering in her eyes as Jake dropped to one knee beside the memorial stones, surrounded by the names of people whose deaths had brought them together and whose memory continued to inspire their work. "Rebecca Hayes," he said, pulling a simple gold ring from his pocket. "Will you marry me?" The proposal was everything Rebecca had hoped for: honest, heartfelt, and grounded in shared values rather than romantic fantasy. This wasn't a fairy tale rescue, but a partnership between equals who'd proven they could face anything together. "Yes," she said simply, her voice carrying across the plaza with the same clarity that had exposed murderers and restored justice. "Yes, Jake Morrison, I'll marry you." As Jake slipped the ring onto her finger, Rebecca heard applause from the direction of Main Street. They turned to see a small crowd of townspeople who'd witnessed the proposal, their faces bright with genuine joy. These weren't strangers celebrating a public spectacle, but friends and neighbors sharing in a moment of happiness that felt like a victory for the entire community. Dr. Margaret Sullivan, who'd replaced the corrupt Dr. Carlyle and become one of Rebecca's closest friends, was dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Martha Patterson from the dress shop was beaming with maternal pride, having watched Rebecca grow from a frightened girl into a confident woman. Even Sheriff Fletcher, formerly Deputy Fletcher, was grinning broadly as he maintained a respectful distance while keeping watch over the growing crowd. "I guess we're not keeping this quiet," Jake observed with amusement. "Good," Rebecca replied firmly. "I'm tired of secrets. From now on, everything important in our lives happens in the open, where the whole community can share it." The ceremony that afternoon was everything the organizers had hoped for and more. The territorial governor, Samuel Crawford, delivered a speech about the importance of vigilance in protecting democratic institutions and holding leaders accountable. Marshal Davidson presented awards to both Jake and Rebecca for their service to federal law enforcement, citing their courage in exposing corruption and protecting witnesses. Most movingly, Daniel Morrison was posthumously honored as a federal agent who'd given his life in service to justice, his sacrifice finally receiving the recognition it deserved. But the moment that would be remembered longest came when Rebecca addressed the crowd. Standing before the memorial stones with Jake beside her, she spoke about the journey from silence to voice, from victim to advocate, from despair to hope. "2 years ago, I stood on these courthouse steps unable to speak, carrying secrets that felt too dangerous to share," she said, her voice reaching every corner of the plaza. "I learned that silence in the face of evil isn't protection, it's complicity. Speaking truth is dangerous, but failing to speak it is deadly." She gestured toward the memorial stones, her voice growing stronger with each word. "These people died because others remained silent about corruption and murder. They died because a community accepted that some truths were too dangerous to tell. We honor them not just by remembering their names, but by promising never again to let fear silence our voices." The crowd listened with rapt attention as Rebecca continued, her words carrying the authority of someone who'd lived every lesson she was teaching. "Redwood Falls isn't perfect. No community is. But we've learned that democracy requires active participation, that justice demands moral courage, and that good people must be willing to stand up and speak out when they witness wrongdoing." She paused, looking out over faces that had become familiar over 2 years of community meetings, school events, and shared struggles. "We've learned that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, but also that the reward for courage is a community where everyone can live with dignity and hope." Her words carried special weight because everyone present knew her story. They'd seen her journey from the terrified girl on the auction block to the confident educator and civic leader she'd become. If Rebecca Hayes could find her voice after such trauma, perhaps they could find theirs in smaller but equally important moments. As the ceremony concluded, people lingered in the plaza, reluctant to end a celebration that felt like a true community gathering. Children played around the memorial stones while their parents discussed local issues with the easy familiarity of citizens who knew their opinions mattered. The contrast with the fearful, secretive atmosphere of 2 years ago was striking and inspiring. Jake and Rebecca found themselves surrounded by well-wishers, congratulating them on their engagement and thanking them again for their role in exposing the conspiracy. But the conversation that moved Rebecca most came from Sarah Chen, a new arrival who'd opened a bakery on Main Street. "Miss Hayes," Sarah said shyly, "I wanted to thank you for what you did. My family came here from San Francisco because we heard Redwood Falls was a place where honest people could build a good life. That's only true because you had the courage to speak up." Similar conversations happened throughout the evening as the community celebrated with dancing, music, and food in the town square. The territorial government had provided funding for a proper celebration, recognizing Redwood Falls as a model for other communities struggling with corruption. Families who'd lost loved ones to the conspiracy mingled with newcomers, drawn by the town's reputation for integrity. Children played games, while adults discussed everything from school funding to municipal improvements with the engaged enthusiasm of true democratic participation. The evening's entertainment included a performance by the newly formed Redwood Falls Community Choir, which sang songs about freedom, justice, and hope. There were readings from the territorial constitution, reminding everyone of the principles that governed their democracy. Most memorably, several children performed a play they'd written about speaking up against bullying, showing how the lessons of the conspiracy's exposure had filtered down to the youngest members of the community. As the evening wound down, Jake and Rebecca walked home together through streets lit by gas lamps and the warm glow from windows of honest businesses. The town felt safe, prosperous, and alive with possibility, everything it had pretended to be during the conspiracy's reign, but finally was in reality. "Do you think we'll tell our children about the auction?" Rebecca asked as they reached the front porch of the house they'd share after their wedding, a modest but comfortable home they'd purchased together, symbolizing their equal partnership. "Every detail," Jake replied without hesitation. "They need to understand how easily good people can be deceived by those in authority, how important it is to question what they're told and trust their own moral instincts." Rebecca nodded, thinking about the curriculum she was developing for schools throughout the territory. The story of Redwood Falls would become a case study in how communities could recover from corruption, but also in how vigilance was the price of freedom. "And we'll tell them about the importance of speaking up when they witness injustice," she added. "Even when it's frightening, even when it seems hopeless, even when the people in power want them to stay quiet." They stood together on the porch, looking out over the town they'd helped save and rebuild. In the distance, the mountains rose like sentinels against a star-filled sky, their peaks touched with silver moonlight. The valley that had once hidden systematic murder now sheltered a community committed to justice and truth. $500, Jake mused, shaking his head at the memory. "I thought I was just saving one person from a terrible fate." "You were," Rebecca said, leaning against his shoulder. "But sometimes saving one person changes everything. Sometimes one act of courage ripples outward until it transforms an entire community." As they prepared to enter their separate homes for the last time before their wedding, both Jake and Rebecca felt the deep satisfaction that comes from lives lived with purpose. They'd faced evil and overcome it, not through violence or vengeance, but through moral courage and determination to see justice done. The mute girl who'd been sold at auction had found her voice and used it to transform a town. The sheriff, who'd lost faith in justice, had helped rebuild it from the ground up. Together, they'd proven that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to accept corruption as inevitable. In the months that followed, their story would spread throughout the territory and beyond. Other communities facing corruption would look to Redwood Falls as proof that change was possible. Other individuals would find courage in Rebecca's example to speak up against injustice in their own lives. But on this night, as the second anniversary of their first meeting came to a close, Jake Morrison and Rebecca Hayes were simply two people who'd found love in the most unlikely circumstances and built something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy. The town that had once sold human beings at auction was now a place where every voice mattered, where justice prevailed over corruption, and where love conquered fear. It wasn't the ending anyone could have predicted when Rebecca stood silent and terrified on the courthouse steps. It was something much better. It was a new beginning, not just for them, but for everyone who believed that good people could change the world, one courageous act at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.